In the first days of September 1939, the German advance moved with relentless speed. Polish defensive lines, already under heavy pressure, began to bend and fragment across multiple sectors. Armored columns pushed deeper into the country. Motorized infantry followed close behind. The strategic objective was becoming clear: Warsaw. As the capital of Poland, Warsaw was more than a political center. It was a symbol, a transportation hub, a command node, a focal point for national resistance. German planners understood that the fall of Warsaw would carry both military and psychological weight. By the second week of the campaign, forward elements of the German advance were already moving along the main approaches to the city. Roads filled with military traffic. Bridges became priority targets. Rail junctions were seized to maintain momentum. Polish forces attempted to slow the advance where possible. Rearguard actions were fought along river lines and key crossroads. But the pace of the German movement created constant pressure. Units forced to withdraw often had little time to reorganize. Meanwhile, inside Warsaw, the situation was growing tense. Defensive preparations accelerated. Barricades were planned, positions assigned. Civil authorities began emergency coordination. The capital was preparing for what now seemed increasingly likely. The war was coming to the city. By mid-September 1939, the situation around Warsaw was tightening. German armored spearheads had advanced rapidly along multiple axes. What had begun as a fast-moving offensive was now shifting toward encirclement. The objective was clear: isolate the capital, cut its supply lines, prevent organized reinforcement. German units moved to seize the key road and rail connections leading into Warsaw. Bridges were captured or destroyed. Rail corridors were disrupted. Communication routes began to fail. Inside the city, reports grew increasingly alarming. Field commanders warned that external support was becoming unlikely. Polish units attempting to withdraw toward Warsaw often found the routes already threatened. Some formations fought their way through. Others were forced to defend south or east. The defensive perimeter around the capital grew more crowded and more strained. Meanwhile, German forces continued to close the ring. Artillery positions were established within range of the city. Forward observation units moved into surrounding villages. Supply routes into Warsaw became dangerous and unreliable. The capital was not yet fully surrounded. But the direction of events was unmistakable. The city was being cut off, and time was running short. As the ring around Warsaw tightened, life inside the city began to change rapidly. What had once been a busy European capital was now a city under growing pressure. Shops shortened their hours. Public transport became irregular. Long lines formed outside food stores. Residents followed the news closely, but reliable information was increasingly scarce. Rumors spread faster than official announcements. Air raid sirens became part of daily life. When they sounded, civilians moved quickly toward basements and improvised shelters. Schools closed in many districts. Government offices shifted to emergency procedures. Throughout the city, defensive preparations continued. Barricades rose at key intersections. Volunteers assisted with sandbagging. Civil defense teams organized fire watch patrols. Despite the tension, daily routines did not disappear overnight. Trams still ran in some neighborhoods. Markets opened when supplies allowed. Families tried to maintain normal life where possible, but the pressure was constant. city grew darker. Blackout measures reduced street lighting. Windows were covered. Searchlights occasionally scanned the sky. Warsaw was not yet destroyed, but it was no longer at peace. The siege had begun to reshape daily life, hour by hour. As September progressed, the pressure on Warsaw escalated sharply. What had begun as probing attacks was now becoming sustained bombardment. German artillery batteries, positioned around the city, began firing more frequently. Air raids also increased in intensity. Bombers targeted rail yards, industrial zones, and key infrastructure. The objective was not only military, it was psychological. Each strike was meant to weaken the city's ability and will to continue resisting. Inside Warsaw, the effects were immediate. Explosions echoed across districts. Emergency crews rushed from site to site. Fire brigades struggled to keep pace with multiple incidents. Smoke began to hang over parts of the city. Civilians spent longer hours in shelters. Sleep became irregular. Normal routines grew harder to maintain. Polish air defenses and anti-aircraft units continued to respond where possible. But the pressure was mounting. Supply deliveries into the city were increasingly dangerous. Damage to infrastructure complicated coordination. Yet, despite the growing strain, organized resistance continued. Military headquarters remained active. Civil defense networks kept operating. The bombardment was intensifying, but Warsaw had not yet fallen. Despite the mounting pressure, Warsaw did not surrender easily. Inside the city, both military units and civilians worked to strengthen the defense. Polish army formations reorganized within the urban perimeter. Key intersections were fortified. Street barricades expanded. Defensive sectors were assigned and reinforced. Urban warfare required a different approach than open-field battles. Buildings became strong points. Intersections became choke points. Narrow streets limited armored movement. Polish commanders aimed to slow the German advance if it reached the city center. Civilian involvement became increasingly important. Volunteers assisted with fortification. Medical workers expanded emergency capacity. Fire brigades operated under constant risk. Communication teams worked to maintain coordination between sectors. Morale inside the city remained strained, but not broken. Radio broadcasts encouraged continued resistance. Posters appeared calling for endurance. Military headquarters continued planning for prolonged defense. Yet the situation remained difficult. Supplies were under pressure. Air and artillery attacks continued. And the encirclement was tightening. Warsaw was still standing. But the cost of holding the capital was rising by the day. As the siege continued, the strain on Warsaw's civilian population deepened. Supply routes into the city had been severely disrupted. Food deliveries became irregular. Basic goods grew scarce. Long queues formed outside remaining distribution points. Inside many neighborhoods, rationing became unavoidable. Water access also became increasingly unreliable in some districts. Damage to infrastructure and constant pressure on city services complicated daily survival. Hospitals faced growing challenges. Medical staff worked extended hours. Supplies of bandages, medicine, and equipment were carefully managed. Emergency clinics appeared in schools, public buildings, and basements. Civilians adapted as best they could. Families conserved food. Neighbors shared resources. Volunteers assisted the elderly and the wounded. Yet the psychological toll was becoming visible. Fatigue spread. Uncertainty weighed efforts were organized where possible. Distribution networks improvised. Medical teams remained active under difficult circumstances. The siege was no longer only a military contest. It had become a humanitarian emergency. As the bombardment intensified and supplies dwindled, the situation inside Warsaw grew increasingly fragile. It was at this moment that the final ultimatum arrived. German command demanded the city's surrender. The message was direct. Further resistance would lead to continued bombardment. Capitulation, it was implied, would prevent additional destruction. Inside Warsaw, the announcement carried enormous weight. Military leaders gathered to assess the situation. Reports from defensive sectors were reviewed. Medical shortages were evaluated. Food reserves were recalculated. The question was no longer whether the city could resist. It was how long and at what cost. Civil authorities faced a parallel dilemma: protect the population through surrender, or continue the defense in the hope of relief that seemed increasingly unlikely. Communication within the city intensified. Orders were reviewed. Contingency plans discussed. Outside the perimeter, German forces maintained pressure. Artillery positions remained active. Air raids continued. The ultimatum was not delivered in isolation. It was delivered amid ongoing force. Warsaw stood at a crossroads. The decision that followed would define the city's fate. By late September 1939, the leadership inside Warsaw faced an increasingly stark reality. The city was still resisting, but its capacity to continue was fading. Military reports indicated mounting strain across defensive sectors. Ammunition stocks were under pressure. Food supplies were dangerously low. Medical facilities were operating beyond sustainable limits. Communication with external Polish forces had become unreliable. Hopes for coordinated relief were diminishing. Inside command headquarters, the discussion was no longer theoretical. It was urgent. Continue resistance and risk further civilian suffering, or accept capitulation to preserve what remained of the city. The decision weighed heavily on both military and civil authorities. Warsaw had become more than a battlefield. It was home to hundreds of thousands of civilians. Each additional day of bombardment increased the humanitarian cost. Field reports described exhausted defenders. Civilian infrastructure was under growing stress. Key services were becoming difficult to maintain. In the final deliberations, the balance shifted. Not because the will to resist had disappeared, but because the cost of continued defense was becoming unsustainable. The decision to surrender was not sudden. It was the result of cumulative pressure. Warsaw had held out under intense conditions, but the limits of endurance had been reached. In the final days of September 1939, the outcome became unavoidable. After weeks of bombardment, isolation, and mounting humanitarian strain, Warsaw prepared to capitulate. Negotiations moved quickly. Military representatives met to formalize the terms. Orders were issued across the city's defensive sectors. Ceasefire instructions began to spread. Inside Warsaw, the moment was heavy with exhaustion and uncertainty. For many defenders, the decision was deeply painful. They had held the capital under extreme pressure. The limits of endurance had been reached. Artillery fire gradually diminished. Air activity soared. In several districts, the sounds of combat faded into an uneasy silence. Units began the process of standing down. Weapons were secured. Positions were abandoned. Warsaw marked the end of organized resistance in the Polish capital. But the wider war was only beginning. The fall of Warsaw marked the end of one phase of the war, but the beginning of a much larger conflict. Militarily, the campaign in Poland had demonstrated the effectiveness of Germany's fast-moving operational doctrine. The rapid advance, coordinated air support, and encirclement tactics had reshaped expectations of modern warfare. Across Europe, military observers took careful note. Strategic planners in other nations began reassessing their own readiness. The psychological impact was equally significant. The collapse of Poland's capital signaled that the war would not be short or easily contained. Britain and France were now fully committed. Mobilization expanded. Industrial production accelerated. Defensive planning intensified along Western Europe's borders. For Poland, the consequences were immediate and severe. Organized national resistance would continue in different forms. But the loss of Warsaw represented a major strategic and symbolic blow. For Germany, the campaign appeared, at least temporarily, successful. The eastern phase of operations had achieved its primary objective. But beneath the surface, the conflict was already widening. The alliances formed in September 1939 would pull more nations into the war. What had begun with the invasion of Poland was evolving into a global confrontation. The fall of Warsaw was not the end of the story. It was the opening chapter of a far longer war.